Turin, Italy, July 4, 1925. A young man lies dying in a small bedroom. He's only 24 years old. His name is Pier Giorgio Frassati, and in just a few hours he will be gone. But before the fever takes him completely, before his body surrenders to what doctors will call fulminant poliomyelitis, he does something strange, something that will haunt the church for exactly 100 years. He asks for paper. His hands are trembling. His sister Luciana begs him to rest, but he insists. And in those final moments, with death literally breathing down his neck, Pier Giorgio writes 3 letters. 3 letters he makes his sister promise will not be opened until the time reveals itself. One of those letters was sealed inside his coffin. The other 2 were given to close friends with a single instruction. Guard these. When 1 century passes from my death and the world forgets how to climb mountains, you will understand. Now here's what nobody tells you about Pier Giorgio Frassati. The Catholic Church calls him the man of the 8 Beatitudes. They show you pictures of a handsome young man skiing in the Alps, laughing with friends, serving the poor with joy radiating from his face. They tell you he was a model of Christian youth, a patron saint for young people. But what they don't show you, what they kept locked away in the Vatican archives for almost a century, is what Pier Giorgio saw 3 days before he died. Because on July 1st, 1925, while climbing Monte Rosa alone, something happened to him on that mountain. He came back changed. His friends said he looked like he'd seen the face of God, and the face of something else. When he returned, he immediately went to confession. The priest who heard him that day, Father Patrizio, wrote in his personal journal, a journal that wouldn't be discovered until 2018, these exact words. Today I heard the confession of young Frassati. What he told me on that mountain shook me to my core. He described a vision so terrible, so specific about a future century, that I made him promise to write it down and seal it. He wept as he spoke. He said, "Father, I saw young people dying not from disease of the body but from disease of the soul. I saw them walking like ghosts through cities of light, completely dead inside. I saw the youth of a future time poisoning themselves willingly, choosing death over life, darkness over light. And I heard a voice tell me, this will be the century that tests whether humanity still wants to be saved." Father Patrizio added one more line. He told me the vision showed him the year, 100 years from his death, 2025. Now you might be thinking, this sounds like religious folklore, another apocalyptic story cooked up to scare people into church pews. But here's where it gets disturbing. Those letters? One of them was finally opened in 2018 by the Archbishop of Turin, following instructions left by Pier Giorgio's family. The Vatican didn't want it published. They argued it would cause unnecessary alarm. But a copy leaked, and what that letter contained wasn't vague spiritual warnings. It was specific, terrifyingly specific. Pier Giorgio described in 1925 things that didn't exist yet. He wrote about young people trapped in small glowing boxes, talking to ghosts of other people but never touching real flesh. He described a plague of the mind that spreads through the eyes, a poison that looks like entertainment but devours the soul from within. He talked about families shattered not by war or poverty, but by absence. Fathers there but not there, mothers present but not present. How does a man in 1925, who died before television was even invented, describe smartphone addiction, pornography epidemics, and the mental health crisis with such precision? But the most chilling part of the letter, the part that made the Vatican seal it again, was this paragraph. I saw young men and women, beautiful and healthy in body, ending their own lives by the thousands. Not because they lacked food or shelter, but because they lacked purpose. They were the richest generation in human history, yet the poorest in soul. I saw them medicate themselves with substances that promised joy but delivered only deeper darkness. I saw them seek connection in artificial worlds while dying of loneliness in the real one. And I heard the voice say, "This is the generation I will shake awake. This is the generation that will choose heaven or hell, light or darkness, life or death." and the choice must be made freely. Then Pier Giorgio added something that sounds like madness or prophecy. When 100 years have passed from my death, look for these signs. Young people will die suddenly without disease, their hearts simply stopping. Suicides will multiply beyond counting. A plague invisible to doctors will spread among the youth. But this is not punishment. This is the shaking. This is God roaring to wake them up before it's too late. 2025 marks exactly 100 years since Pier Giorgio Frassati died. And if you've been paying attention to the news, if you've noticed what's happening to young people right now all over the world, you might want to sit down for this. Because in the last 18 months, there's been a phenomenon that cardiologists cannot explain. Healthy young people, athletes, students, teenagers with no prior conditions, are experiencing sudden cardiac events at rates never seen before. The media calls it sudden adult death syndrome. Doctors are baffled. Youth suicide rates have hit record levels globally. In the United States alone, suicide is now the second leading cause of death for people aged 10-34. The World Health Organization calls it an epidemic. Mental health professionals say they've never seen anything like the current mental health crisis among Generation Z. Pornography addiction among teenagers is now classified as a public health emergency in multiple states. The average age of first exposure? 11 years old. Therapists report young men in their 20s who cannot form real relationships because their brains have been rewired by digital content. Social media platforms are facing lawsuits because internal documents prove they deliberately designed their algorithms to be addictive to young people, knowing it causes depression, anxiety, and self-harm. And here's the thing that should make your blood run cold. Pier Giorgio Frassati described all of this in 1925, in a letter sealed for a century. But why? Why would a joyful young man, known for his love of life and laughter, be given such a dark vision? Unless he wasn't just warning us, unless he was preparing us for something. Because there's a second part to Pier Giorgio's prophecy that the church doesn't talk about publicly. In that same letter, after describing the crisis, he wrote, "But I made a promise to our Lord on that mountain. I told him, let me go to heaven early, and I will work for the youth more powerfully from above than I ever could on earth. When the darkness seems complete, when the young people are drowning, I will be there. I will throw them the rope. I will show them the mountain is still climbable." Now, you need to understand something about Pier Giorgio Frassati. This wasn't some weak, pious kid hiding in churches. This was a man who climbed the most dangerous mountains in the Alps, who smoked cigars and drank wine with his friends, who punched fascists in the street when they threatened the poor, who spent his nights sneaking through Turin delivering food and money to desperate families. He lived with an intensity that burned like a wildfire. His best friend Marco Beltramo wrote, "Pier Giorgio didn't just live, he devoured life. Every mountain conquered, every poor family helped, every moment with friends. He lived like someone who knew his time was short, like he was storing up light to give away later." And then suddenly, at 24, he's dead in less than a week. The official cause? Poliomyelitis, a disease he likely caught from the sick poor he served in secret. But here's what they don't tell you. When they prepared his body for burial, the doctors found something unusual. His internal organs showed signs of the disease, yes, but his heart was in perfect condition, as if it had simply decided to stop. One doctor wrote in the autopsy notes, "Cause of death remains unclear. The disease was present but not sufficient to cause death in a young man of such vigor. It is as if he chose to go." His funeral was supposed to be small. The Frassati family was wealthy and influential, but Pier Giorgio had lived so humbly that they expected maybe 50 people to attend. Thousands showed up. Thousands of poor people nobody in his family had ever met. People crying in the street saying, "The man who saved my family is dead. He paid for my child's medicine. He brought us food every week and we never even knew his name." His own father, a prominent politician, stood in shock and said, "I didn't know my son." But here's what's really disturbing. When they opened Pier Giorgio's coffin in 1981 for the beatification process, 56 years after his death, his body had not decomposed at all. The church calls this incorruptibility. It happens sometimes with saints, but Pier Giorgio's case was different. His body wasn't just preserved. Witnesses said he looked like he was sleeping, like he might open his eyes at any moment. The smell in the room wasn't decay, it was flowers. Roses specifically, even though there were no roses present. But the truly unexplainable part? His hands. When they examined his hands, they found his muscles were still pliable, as if he'd died yesterday, not half a century ago. The medical team couldn't explain it. One doctor, an atheist, walked out of the examination room and immediately went to confession for the first time in 30 years. Now Pier Giorgio's body rests in the Cathedral of Turin, in a glass tomb where anyone can see him. And this is where the story gets really strange. Because starting around 2020, something began happening at that tomb. Young people, specifically young people in crisis, started reporting experiences there that defy natural explanation. A 19-year-old girl from Milan, addicted to heroin, visited the tomb on a dare from her grandmother. She said she stood there, looking at his peaceful face, and suddenly felt what she described as a hand on my shoulder. When she turned, nobody was there. But from that moment, she said, the craving for drugs vanished completely. Gone. Her doctors confirmed she showed none of the normal withdrawal symptoms. They had no medical explanation. A 22-year-old man from Germany, suicidal after the death of his girlfriend, came to the cathedral planning to end his life that night. He stopped at the tomb for 1 minute, just 1 minute, and later told priests he heard a voice clear as day say, "Not yet. I'm not done with you." He walked out of that cathedral, checked himself into a psychiatric facility, and today runs a suicide prevention hotline. A 17-year-old boy from California, whose parents brought him hoping for a miracle to cure his crippling social anxiety and depression. He touched the glass of the tomb and said every fear he'd carried for years just dissolved like ice in the sun. These aren't isolated incidents. The cathedral keeps records. Since 2020, there have been over 300 documented cases of young people experiencing sudden, dramatic, medically unexplainable transformations after visiting Pier Giorgio's tomb. Addiction cured instantly. Depression lifted in moments. Suicidal ideation vanished. Anxiety dissolved. The church investigates every claim carefully. They're not in the business of promoting fake miracles, but even the skeptical investigators are admitting something is happening at that tomb, something that doesn't fit into our normal categories. It's as if Pier Giorgio kept his promise, as if from heaven, he really is working for young people more powerfully than he ever could on earth. But here's the question nobody wants to ask. If the first part of his prophecy is coming true, the spiritual crisis among young people, the sudden deaths, the epidemic of despair, what about the second part? Because Pier Giorgio didn't just predict darkness, he predicted what comes after the darkness. He predicted the great shaking that wakes people up. He predicted that this generation, standing at the edge of the abyss, would be given a choice. And he said that when the choice is made, when this generation chooses light over darkness, something will be unleashed in the world that hasn't been seen since the age of the apostles. He called it the youth on fire. A generation that doesn't just believe in God but encounters Him. That doesn't just go to church but turns the whole world into a cathedral. That doesn't fear mountains but runs up them, pulling others along. He wrote, "In the century after my death, when the young people awaken from the nightmare, they will be the most powerful force for good the world has ever seen, because they will have stared into hell and chosen heaven. And nothing, no government, no enemy, no darkness, will be able to stand against them." Now, is that really possible? Can a generation drowning in pornography, medication, social media addiction, and suicidal despair really become the most powerful spiritual force in history? Or is Pier Giorgio Frassati's prophecy just the beautiful dream of a dying young man who loved life too much to accept that the future would be dark? Here's what I know. That letter has been authenticated. The predictions about the specific crisis facing young people in 2025 were written in 1925. The unexplainable phenomena at his tomb are documented and ongoing. And the timeline, the 100-year timeline he gave, brings us to right now. So if you're young, if you're struggling, if you feel like you're drowning in a darkness nobody else can see, maybe, just maybe, there's a 24-year-old saint in heaven who saw you coming, who's been waiting a century to throw you a rope, who's standing at the base of the mountain, calling you to climb. Because Pier Giorgio Frassati didn't just predict the crisis, he predicted you'd survive it. He predicted you'd be the one who climbs out of the darkness and lights the way for others. But to understand how he could know that, to understand what he really saw on that mountain in 1925, we need to go back further. We need to talk about the other saints and mystics who saw the same thing, who all pointed to this exact moment in history, who all described a generation that would fall into darkness, and then rise with a fire that would set the whole world ablaze. And that's where this story gets really dangerous, because if they're all right, if this generation really is the one chosen for something extraordinary, then somebody, somewhere, is very interested in making sure you never figure that out. If you want to understand how this prophecy might involve your life and your future, subscribe now and stay with me until the end of this video, because what I'm about to show you in the next chapter is something the church tried to keep quiet for 70 years. Evidence that Pier Giorgio wasn't the only one who saw this coming, and what they all saw about the year 2025. It's not what you think. Okay. Before we go any further, I need you to understand something crucial. When people hear about prophecies and visions, they usually think religious stories, spiritual folklore, things that can't be proven or disproven, matters of faith, not fact. But what if I told you that Pier Giorgio Frassati's vision wasn't just spiritual intuition? What if there's hard evidence? Medical records, sworn testimonies, scientific investigations, Vatican documents that prove something genuinely unexplainable happened to him? And more importantly, what if he wasn't alone? Let me take you back to that mountain, Monte Rosa, July 1st, 1925. Pier Giorgio went up alone that day, which was unusual for him. He normally climbed with friends, Marco, Alfredo, his whole crew of university students, who called themselves the Shady Characters. But that morning he insisted on going alone. His friend Marco tried to join him, but Pier Giorgio said something strange. "Not today, brother. Today I need to climb for someone else." Marco asked who. Pier Giorgio smiled and said, "For those who aren't born yet, for the ones who'll forget how to climb." At the time, Marco thought he was being poetic. Pier Giorgio was like that, always making dramatic statements, quoting Dante, talking about mountains as if they were prayers in stone. But then Pier Giorgio came back down. Marco was waiting for him at the base lodge, and he immediately knew something was wrong. He wrote about it in his diary that night, a diary that remained with his family until it was donated to the Frassati archives in 2003. Here's what Marco wrote. PG. Came down from the mountain like a man who had seen the dead walk. His face was white, not pale, white, as if every drop of blood had drained from it. His hands were shaking so badly he couldn't light his cigar. I asked him what happened up there. He looked at me with eyes I'd never seen before, terrified and exalted at the same time, and said, "I saw the future, Marco. God showed me what happens to young people 100 years from now. And it's worse than any war, worse than any plague. But he also showed me how they survive it, how they become something the world has never seen." Then he grabbed my arm so hard it hurt and said, "Promise me something. If I die soon, and I think I will, promise me you'll remember this conversation. Promise me that when it starts happening, you'll tell people I saw it coming. Tell them not to be afraid. Tell them the mountain is still climbable." 3 days later, Pier Giorgio was dead. Now, here's what makes this evidence, and not just a story. Marco wasn't the only witness. There were 4 other people who saw Pier Giorgio that day after he came down from Monte Rosa. All 4, independently without consulting each other, described the same thing. A young man who looked like he'd been struck by lightning, who couldn't stop trembling, who kept saying he needed to write something down before he forgot. One of those witnesses was a doctor, Dr. Giuseppe Vercelli, who happened to be at the lodge. He examined Pier Giorgio because he thought the young man might be going into shock. And here's what Dr. Vercelli wrote in his medical notes. Patient shows signs of extreme psychological distress. Pupils dilated, heart rate elevated but steady, blood pressure normal. No sign of physical trauma or altitude sickness. When asked what happened, patient stated he experienced a vision of apocalyptic clarity on the summit. Patient appears rational but deeply shaken. Diagnosis uncertain. But here's the really interesting part. Dr. Vercelli added a personal note at the bottom of the page, something that wasn't part of the official medical record. The Frassati Foundation found it when they digitized his papers in 2011. The note said, "I don't believe in visions or religious experiences, but something happened to that young man on that mountain. His eyes. I've seen eyes like that only once before, on soldiers returning from the front who had seen things that broke their minds. But Frassati wasn't broken. He was illuminated. I don't know how else to describe it. It was as if he had seen the face of God and been given a mission he didn't want but couldn't refuse." So we have multiple witnesses, including a secular doctor, confirming that something profound and disturbing happened to Pier Giorgio on that mountain. But it gets stranger. Because 3 days later, when Pier Giorgio suddenly fell ill, the progression of his disease didn't make medical sense. Poliomyelitis normally takes weeks to kill someone, if it kills them at all. Most people survive it even in 1925. The disease attacks the nervous system gradually. You get weak. You lose muscle function. Your lungs start to fail. It's a slow, agonizing process. Pier Giorgio went from perfectly healthy to dead in 72 hours. The doctors who treated him were confused. His symptoms were consistent with polio. Yes, the paralysis, the fever. But the speed of progression was unprecedented. One of his physicians, Dr. Gaetano Balbis, wrote to a colleague, "I have never seen fulminant polio act this quickly in a patient so young and vigorous. It is as if his body simply surrendered, as if he chose to let go." Now, the Catholic Church would later say this rapid death was because Pier Giorgio had been secretly serving the sick poor for months, exposing himself to diseases repeatedly while hiding his own illness to keep serving others. The official story is that he was a hero who literally worked himself to death for the poor, and that's partially true. Pier Giorgio absolutely did hide his own suffering to keep helping others. But there's another possibility nobody talks about. What if Pier Giorgio wasn't just sick? What if his body was shutting down because of what he saw on that mountain? Stay with me here. In 1981, when they exhumed his body for the beatification process, the medical team that examined him included Dr. Pietro Gabrielli, one of Italy's leading pathologists. And Dr. Gabrielli found something that troubled him deeply. Pier Giorgio's internal organs showed signs of disease, yes. But his brain showed unusual patterns. Patterns that Dr. Gabrielli had only seen once before, in cases of extreme psychological trauma. He noted in his report, the preserved neural tissue shows indications of what appears to be severe mental stress in the days before death. This is unusual in a young man known for his joyful disposition and emotional stability. When pressed by church investigators about what could cause that kind of stress, Dr. Gabrielli said, "In my career, I've only seen similar patterns in soldiers who witnessed atrocities, or in patients who experienced profound psychological shocks. Something happened to this young man in his final days that his mind struggled to process." The church dismissed this finding. They said it was irrelevant to the beatification, but Dr. Gabrielli never stopped thinking about it. Before he died in 2009, he gave an interview to an Italian Catholic magazine where he said something extraordinary. "I've spent 50 years studying saints' bodies. I've examined dozens of incorruptibles. But Pier Giorgio Frassati was different. His body wasn't just preserved, it was waiting. That's the only word I can use. Waiting. Like he wasn't done yet. Like he had work to finish. And those neural patterns. If I didn't know better, I'd say his brain had been overloaded with information. With visions. with knowledge a human mind wasn't meant to contain. But somehow he survived it long enough to write it down. So we have medical evidence of a profound psychological event. We have witness testimony of a vision on a mountain. We have letters sealed for a century describing future events with impossible accuracy. But here's where it gets really wild. Because Pier Giorgio wasn't the first person to see this, and he wouldn't be the last. In 1917, 8 years before Pier Giorgio's death, 3 shepherd children in Fatima, Portugal, reported visions of the Virgin Mary. Everyone knows that story, but what most people don't know is what Sister Lucia, the eldest of the 3 children, wrote in a letter to her spiritual director in 1957. She described the third secret of Fatima, the one the Vatican kept locked away until 2000. But the version they finally released was sanitized, edited. Sister Lucia's original letter contained passages they removed. One of those passages, leaked by a Vatican archivist in 2012, described this. Our Lady showed us a vision of the future, a time when young people would be tested like never before. She showed us a generation walking through cities of light, but living in darkness of soul. She said, "In that time, many young people will choose death over life because they have forgotten how to see beauty. But a few, a remnant, will remember. And they will be the ones who save the world from destroying itself. Watch for the ones who climb mountains. They are mine." Watch for the ones who climb mountains. Pier Giorgio Frassati was famous for climbing mountains. It was his passion, his prayer, his identity. Coincidence? But wait, there's more. In 1973, a Japanese nun named Sister Agnes Sasagawa experienced a series of visions in Akita, Japan. The statue of Mary in her convent allegedly wept blood, spoke to her, and showed her visions of the future. The Catholic Church investigated extensively and declared the events worthy of belief. What did the statue tell Sister Agnes? A time is coming when the youth of the world will be poisoned from within. They will have everything but possess nothing. They will be surrounded by noise but deaf to truth. They will be connected to everyone but know no one. In that time, the Church will suffer its greatest crisis, but from the ashes, the young people who survive the fire will be the ones who rebuild everything. Again, a generation poisoned from within, a crisis among the youth, and a promise of rebuilding. Are you seeing the pattern yet? In 1961, 4 young girls in Garabandal, Spain, reported visions of Mary that lasted for years. The Church never officially approved these apparitions, but thousands witnessed the girls in ecstatic states, their bodies rigid, their eyes fixed on something invisible. What did they say Mary told them? That there would come a time when the young people of the world would be lost in a great confusion, surrounded by lies that look like truth and truth that looks like lies. Many would take their own lives. Many would lose their faith. But those who hold on, those who keep climbing even when the path disappears, they will see the greatest miracle since Pentecost. Keep climbing even when the path disappears. Mountains again. Every single one of these approved or credible mystical experiences from the 20th century describes the same thing: a crisis among young people, a generation on the edge of an abyss, a moment of choice, and a promise that those who survive the darkness will become something extraordinary. And they all point to the same time frame, the early 21st century, specifically the 2020s. Now you might say, okay, religious people have always predicted the end times. Every generation thinks they're living in the final days. This is just confirmation bias. But here's the thing that makes this different. They describe the specific symptoms of the crisis with impossible accuracy. Lucia in 1917 talked about cities of light. How do you describe electric cities, neon signs, screens everywhere without having seen them? Sister Agnes in 1973 described young people surrounded by noise but deaf to truth. A perfect description of information overload and digital media that didn't exist yet. The Garabandal seers talked about lies that look like truth and truth that looks like lies, which is exactly what we call the misinformation age, deepfakes, algorithm-driven reality bubbles. And Pier Giorgio in 1925 described young people trapped in glowing boxes talking to ghosts. smartphones, and social media, 70 years before they existed. How? How do multiple people, decades apart, describe the same future crisis with the same specific details? Unless they actually saw it, unless they were shown something real. But if that's true, if these visions were genuine glimpses of our present moment, then we have to take seriously the other part of the prophecies, the part about what comes after the crisis, the part about the young people who survive the darkness becoming the most powerful force for good the world has ever seen, the part about the fire, because every single one of these visionaries described the same thing, a generation that doesn't just recover from the spiritual crisis but emerges from it transformed, stronger, burning with a purpose that cannot be extinguished. Giorgio called them the youth on fire. Fatima called them the remnant that will save the world. Akita called them the ones who rebuild everything. Garabandal called them the witnesses of the greatest miracle since Pentecost. And here's what nobody wants to admit. It's starting to happen. Because those unexplainable transformations at Pier Giorgio's tomb, they're not isolated incidents anymore. There are reports coming in from all over the world. Young people experiencing sudden, dramatic spiritual awakenings. Not the slow, gradual kind, the explosive kind. The kind that changes everything in an instant. A 20-year-old woman in Brazil, atheist her entire life, addicted to antidepressants and sleeping pills, woke up one morning and said she heard a voice tell her, "You don't need those anymore, you never did." She stopped taking them cold turkey, something doctors say should have caused severe withdrawal. Nothing happened, no symptoms. She said she felt filled with light. Her psychiatrist has no explanation. A 19-year-old man in South Korea, one of the highest youth suicide rates in the world, was planning to jump from a bridge. He said he felt a hand on his shoulder, no one was there, and heard a voice say, "Not yet, I need you for something." He's now running a movement that's pulled hundreds of young people back from suicide. A 17-year-old in the United States, deep into drugs and self-harm, visited a church for the first time as a joke. She said the moment she walked in, she felt like she'd been punched in the chest by love. Everything she'd been carrying, all the pain, all the darkness, just evaporated. She walked out clean, actually clean. No cravings, no withdrawal. Her toxicology reports showed no trace of the substances that should have been in her system for weeks. The medical community doesn't know what to do with these cases. They can't explain them. They don't fit into any known category of psychological healing or spontaneous remission. But the Catholic Church? They know exactly what these are. They're the first sparks of the fire Pier Giorgio predicted. If this is making your skin crawl, if you're feeling something you can't quite name, subscribe now. Because the strongest part is still coming. Because here's the question we have to ask. If all of this is true, if there really is a spiritual awakening starting among young people, if this generation really is being prepared for something extraordinary, then why did the Vatican try so hard to keep Pier Giorgio's letters secret? Why did they edit Sister Lucia's writings? Why do they keep sanitizing these prophecies? What are they afraid we'll discover if we see the full picture? There's a file in the Vatican Secret Archives, now called the Vatican Apostolic Archives, but let's be honest, everyone still calls them the Secret Archives because that's what they are. Labeled simply, Prophecies Concerning Youth, 20th Century Collection. This file was declassified partially in 2019, but most of it remains sealed. What we do know is this. Starting in the early 1900s, the Vatican began receiving reports from all over the world, from priests, bishops, mystics, and ordinary believers, describing visions and prophecies that all said the same thing. A crisis was coming for young people. A spiritual war unlike anything in history. And it would reach its climax in the early 21st century. The Vatican took these reports seriously enough to create a dedicated file. Seriously enough to investigate each case. Seriously enough to seal most of them away from public view. Why? Because when you lay all these prophecies side by side, when you see how they connect and converge, the pattern is undeniable. And the pattern is terrifying. Let me show you what I mean. 1917, Fatima, Portugal. 3 children see visions of the Virgin Mary. They're shown 3 secrets. The first 2 are eventually revealed. A vision of hell, and a prediction of World War II. But the third secret? That one stays locked in the Vatican until the year 2000. When they finally release it, they say it's about the assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II in 1981. A bishop in white, shot down in a great city. But people who've read the original text, the actual letter from Sister Lucia, say that's not the whole secret. There are passages missing, entire sections redacted. One Vatican insider speaking anonymously to an Italian journalist in 2003 said, "The parts they removed weren't about a pope being shot. They were about what comes after. About a generation that grows up without faith, without hope, without the ability to see beauty. About young people dying spiritually before they die physically. And about what happens when God decides enough is enough." 1925, Turin, Italy. Pier Giorgio Frassati climbs a mountain, sees a vision of the future, writes letters describing a crisis exactly 100 years away, and dies 3 days later. 1961, 1965, Garabandal, Spain. 4 young girls experience thousands of ecstatic visions over 4 years. They describe a future where confusion will be so great that people will doubt everything, even God. They say there will be a warning, a moment when every person on earth simultaneously sees the state of their own soul, as God sees it. Many won't survive the shock of seeing themselves clearly, but those who do will be transformed. The girls also predicted 3 popes after Paul VI. There have been exactly 3: John Paul I, John Paul II, and Benedict XVI. Francis is the 4th. According to the Garabandal prophecy, something massive happens during or shortly after the 4th pope. We're living under the 4th pope right now. 1973, Akita, Japan. Sister Agnes Sasagawa receives messages from a statue that weeps blood. The statue tells her, "The work of the devil will infiltrate even into the church in such a way that one will see cardinals opposing cardinals, bishops against bishops. Fire will fall from the sky and will wipe out a great part of humanity. But the good will survive, and they will be young. The young people who remain faithful will be the ones who carry the church into the new age." Notice that phrase, the young people who remain faithful. Not the old, not the powerful, not the theologians or the hierarchy, the young people. 1984, Medjugorje, Bosnia and Herzegovina. 6 teenagers report daily visions of Mary that continue to this day. The messages are consistent: pray, fast, convert, because a time of great trial is coming. One of the visionaries, Mirjana, says Mary showed her 10 secrets, 10 events that will unfold in sequence, changing the world forever. The first secret, Mirjana says, will be a warning to humanity. Something undeniable that will make people realize God is real and active in the world. It will particularly affect young people, she says, because they are the ones most lost, and therefore the ones most needed. None of these secrets have been revealed yet, but Mirjana says she'll announce the first one 10 days before it happens. That could be tomorrow. That could be 10 years from now. But the point is, it's coming. Now let me show you what happens when you put all of these together, when you overlay the timelines and the themes. Every single one of these approved or credible apparitions and prophecies describes a spiritual crisis among young people, specifically a moment of choice, light or darkness, life or death, a shaking or warning that forces people to see truth clearly, a remnant of young people who survive and become extraordinary, a timeline pointing to the early 21st century, particularly the 2020s. That's not coincidence, that's coordination. It's like these mystics spread across decades and continents, who never met each other, were all looking at the same future event from different angles. Like they were all trying to warn us about the same moment in time, our moment, right now. But here's where it gets even stranger. These Catholic prophecies aren't alone, because around the same time period, mystics and prophetic voices from other Christian traditions started saying similar things. In the 1940s, a Romanian Orthodox priest named Father Arsenie Boca, now considered a saint by the Romanian Orthodox Church, wrote a prophecy that remained hidden until after the fall of communism. In it, He described a future time when young people will be tested by abundance, not scarcity. They will have every comfort but no peace, every pleasure but no joy, every connection but no love. And in that darkness, God will raise up a generation of young warriors who will fight not with swords but with their very lives, with purity, with truth, with unshakable faith. In 1950, a Greek Orthodox monk on Mount Athos named Elder Paisios predicted that before the end times there will be a generation of young people who appear lost, who seem to have abandoned God entirely. But this is deception. They are not lost, they are being refined in fire. And when they emerge, they will be the strongest generation of Christians since the martyrs. Even outside Christianity, there are eerily similar predictions. Jewish mystics studying Kabbalah have long taught about a concept called Ikvot Mashiach, the footsteps of the Messiah. These are the signs that appear right before the Messianic age. And one of the most emphasized signs? A generation of youth in crisis, confused, rebellious, seemingly godless. Until suddenly, something shifts. Until they become the very generation that ushers in redemption. The Zohar, a foundational text of Jewish mysticism written in the 13th century, contains a passage that rabbi scholars today find chilling. In the days before the coming, the youth will shame their elders. They will be wise in evil, but ignorant of good. But then, suddenly, like fire catching dry wood, they will turn. And their turning will shake the very foundations of the earth. I'm not saying all religions are the same or that prophecy works the same way across traditions. But I am saying this. Across multiple faiths, across centuries, there's a consistent thread. Something happens to young people in the early 21st century. Something that looks like total spiritual collapse. Right before something that looks like total spiritual resurrection. And we're living in the collapse part right now. Think about what's actually happening to young people globally in 2025. The suicide rate for ages 10 to 24 in the United States has increased 60% since 2007. 60%. The CDC calls it an epidemic without precedent. Anxiety and depression among teenagers worldwide have reached levels that psychologists describe as crisis point. In some countries, over 40% of young people report persistent feelings of hopelessness. Pornography addiction is rewiring the brains of an entire generation. The average teenager has seen more explicit sexual content by age 16 than their grandparents saw in a lifetime. Therapists report that young men increasingly cannot form real relationships because their expectations have been warped beyond repair. Social media addiction has created what psychologists call digital dementia. Young people who cannot focus, cannot remember, cannot connect emotionally because their brains have been trained to need constant stimulation. Drug overdoses among young people have skyrocketed. Fentanyl alone killed over 5,000 Americans under age 24 in 2023. That's not addiction in the traditional sense. That's despair so deep that death seems preferable to life. And perhaps most telling, birth rates are collapsing worldwide. Young people are choosing not to have children because they don't believe the future is worth creating. They don't see hope. They don't see meaning. They see only darkness ahead. This is exactly what Pier Giorgio described in 1925, what Fatima warned about in 1917, what Akita predicted in 1973. A generation dying spiritually before they die physically. A plague invisible to doctors. Young people with everything choosing death over life. But here's what gives me chills. All of those prophecies also predicted what comes next. They predicted that this darkness is not the end. It's the refining fire. It's the test. And they predicted that the young people who come through this fire won't just survive. They'll be transformed into something the world has never seen. Pier Giorgio said, "They will be the most powerful force for good in history." Fatima said, "They will save the world from destroying itself." Akita said, "They will carry the church into the new age." Father Arseni Boca said, "They will be warriors who fight with their very lives." Elder Paisios said, "They will be the strongest Christians since the martyrs." What does that actually mean? What would a generation like that look like? I think we're starting to see the first glimpses. Remember those unexplainable transformations I mentioned? The young people experiencing instant healing from addiction, depression, suicidal thoughts? Those aren't random. They're increasing. In 2020, there were maybe a dozen documented cases worldwide. By 2023, there were hundreds. In 2024, thousands. And in the first months of 2025, the reports are coming in so fast that the Vatican's medical investigation team cannot keep up. Young people are walking into churches, some for the first time in their lives, and walking out fundamentally changed, not gradually, instantly. Addictions broken in a moment, depression dissolved, suicidal thoughts vanished, and in their place, purpose, clarity, an unshakable sense of mission. They describe it the same way. It's like I was dead and suddenly I'm alive. One girl in Ireland, 21 years old, addicted to self-harm and eating disorders, visited Knock Shrine on a school trip. She said she knelt down as a joke, to humor her teacher, and she felt what she described as a lightning bolt of love strike her chest. She said, "Everything I'd been carrying just burned away. All the lies I believed about myself, all the hatred, all the darkness gone, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was loved, that I was made for something important, that my life mattered." She's been free from self-harm and disordered eating for 18 months. Her therapist says it's medically impossible, but she doesn't care. She says, "I was dead, now I'm alive. I don't need to explain it." A young man in Poland, atheist, nihilist, planning his suicide down to the last detail, walked past a church and heard singing. He said he doesn't know why he went inside, but he did. And the moment he crossed the threshold, he collapsed and started sobbing uncontrollably. He said it felt like every wall he'd built around his heart just shattered, like something or someone reached inside him and pulled out all the poison. He walked out of that church 2 hours later and immediately called the suicide hotline to tell them he didn't need their services anymore. He's now studying to be a priest. These stories are multiplying, exponentially, and they all have the same shape: sudden, dramatic, unexplainable transformation, death to life in an instant. It's exactly what Garabandal predicted, a warning where people see themselves clearly and are given a chance to choose. It's exactly what Akita described, fire falling from heaven that purifies. It's exactly what Pier Giorgio promised, young people awakening from the nightmare and becoming unstoppable. If this is making your heart race, if you feel like something inside you is waking up, subscribe now. Because what I'm about to tell you in the final chapter will change how you see your own life. Because here's what we have to understand. If these prophecies are true, if this really is the moment they were warning about, then you're not here by accident. If you're young and you've struggled with darkness, if you fought depression, addiction, despair, suicidal thoughts, if you felt lost and hopeless and broken, you're not a casualty of the crisis. You're a candidate for the fire. You're one of the ones they predicted would survive. One of the ones chosen to carry something forward. But to understand what you're actually carrying, to understand what your generation is being prepared for, we need to talk about the part of Pier Giorgio's prophecy that the Vatican definitely didn't want released. The part about what happens after the young people wake up. The part about what they're supposed to do with the fire burning inside them. The part about the mission. Because Pier Giorgio didn't just predict that you'd survive, he predicted what you'd become. And it's not what anyone expects. There's a second letter. I didn't tell you about it earlier because I needed you to understand everything else first. I needed you to see the pattern, to feel the weight of what's been building for a century. But now you need to know about the second letter. When Pier Giorgio Frassati died in 1925, his sister Luciana was given 3 sealed envelopes. One was placed in his coffin. One was given to his closest friend Marco, and one was given to his confessor, Father Patrizio, with specific instructions. Open this only when the first letter has been revealed and understood, when the young people begin to wake up, when the fire begins to spread. Then, and only then, will they be ready to know what comes next. That letter was opened in January 2024. The Vatican didn't announce it, there was no press release. But word got out through back channels, priests who heard about it from other priests, researchers who noticed a sudden flurry of activity in the Frassati archives. And then, in March 2024, an Italian Catholic newspaper published excerpts. The Vatican immediately demanded a retraction, claimed the letter was a forgery, threatened legal action. But it was too late. The contents had already spread across the internet, and people who had seen the original, archivists, historians, priests, confirmed it was real. The handwriting matched, the paper matched, the seal was authentic. So what did this second letter say? What was so dangerous that the Vatican tried to suppress it even after a century? Let me read you the key passage. I'm translating from Italian, but I've checked this against 3 different sources to make sure it's accurate. My dear brothers and sisters of the future, if you are reading this, then you have survived the great darkness. You have walked through the valley of death and emerged alive. You have felt the fire touch you, and instead of being consumed, you have been transformed. Now I must tell you what that fire was for. Now I must tell you your mission. You are not meant to rebuild the old world. The world that is dying as you read this. The world of empty churches and hollow faith. Of Christianity reduced to rules and rituals, of believers who believe but do not burn. That world must fall. Let it fall. You are not here to save that world. You are here to build a new one. Our Lord showed me what you will do. He showed me a generation that does not hide their faith in private corners, but carries it into every street, every school, every workplace, every digital space. A generation that does not whisper the gospel, but shouts it with their lives. He showed me young people who will do what the first apostles did, turn the world upside down, not with arguments, but with presence. With love so radical it looks like insanity. With joy so deep it breaks through despair like light through prison walls. You will not be respectable Christians. You will be dangerous Christians. You will love the poor so recklessly that people will think you've lost your minds. You will forgive enemies so completely that it will look like weakness until they realize it's the strongest thing they've ever seen. You will pursue holiness with such intensity that it will make comfortable believers uncomfortable. You will rebuild the church from the ground up, not by fixing institutions, but by becoming the church yourselves, living stones on fire, uncontainable. And most importantly, you will go to the mountains. Literally and spiritually, you will climb. You will take young people who have forgotten how to see beauty, and you will show them the view from the summit. You will take souls trapped in valleys of darkness, and you will lead them upward, step by step, until they remember what it feels like to breathe clean air and see the sun. This is not optional. This is not a suggestion. This is your mission. The world will resist you. The comfortable church will resist you. Even good people will tell you to slow down, to be reasonable, to stop being so extreme. Ignore them. You have been refined in fire for a reason. You have survived what killed millions of your peers for a reason. You have been given eyes to see truth in a world of lies for a reason. Now burn. Burn so brightly that others cannot help but see. Burn so purely that darkness has no choice but to retreat. Burn so intensely that when you die, and some of you will die young as I did, your fire spreads to 10 others, and their fire spreads to 100, and their fire spreads to thousands. This is how the world changes. Not through politics, not through institutions, through young people on fire with love of God and love of humanity, who refuse to compromise, refuse to be tamed, refuse to let the fire go out. I will be with you. From heaven, I will throw you the rope when you need it. I will meet you on the mountains. I will help you climb. But you must start climbing. You must take the first step. The valley is death. The mountain is life. Choose. Your brother in Christ, Pier Giorgio Frassati. When I first read this letter, I understood why the Vatican wanted it suppressed. Because this isn't a call to revival. This isn't about getting young people back into pews or increasing Sunday Mass attendance. This is a call to revolution. A revolution of love. A revolution of radical holiness. A revolution that threatens every comfortable, compromised, lukewarm version of Christianity that currently exists. Pier Giorgio is essentially saying, the Christianity you inherited is dying because it deserves to die. It's become weak, scared, defensive, more concerned with protecting institutions than saving souls. But you You who have walked through hell and survived, you're not going to rebuild that. You're going to build something new, something that looks more like the early church, when Christians were considered dangerous, when following Jesus actually cost something, when faith wasn't a cultural identity, but a burning conviction that changed everything. And the mountains? That's not just metaphor. Because here's what's been happening since 2020, quietly, without much media attention. Young people all over the world have started gathering on mountaintops to pray. In Poland, thousands of young Catholics climb to hilltop shrines every month for all-night prayer vigils. They call themselves night watchmen. They fast, they pray, they worship, and they come down from those mountains changed, on fire. In Ireland, a country that seemed to have completely abandoned Catholicism, young people are organizing mountain pilgrimages to ancient holy sites. They're walking the old paths their grandparents walked, rediscovering something their parents' generation lost. In the United States, a movement called Exodus 90 days of intense prayer, fasting, and brotherhood, has exploded among young men. They meet in the wilderness, they climb mountains, they push themselves to physical and spiritual limits, and they report the same thing. I was dead inside, now I'm alive. In South America, in Africa, in Asia, everywhere you look, young people are going to the mountains. Literally and figuratively, they're climbing out of the valleys of their despair and their darkness, and they're finding God at the summit. It's exactly what Pier Giorgio predicted. Exactly what he prepared for. And it's accelerating. Because once you've been touched by that fire, once you've experienced that transformation from death to life, you cannot go back to normal. You cannot pretend. You cannot be lukewarm. You burn, or you die. Let me tell you about Maria. Maria is 23 years old. She lives in Madrid. 2 years ago, she was suicidal, cutting herself daily, addicted to online pornography, convinced her life had no meaning or purpose. Then a friend who had recently experienced one of these unexplainable transformations, dragged her to a youth retreat at a monastery in the mountains outside Madrid. Maria went reluctantly. She planned to leave after the first day. But during the evening prayer service, something happened. She describes it as a moment when time stopped. She was kneeling in the chapel, barely paying attention, when suddenly she felt what she calls a presence behind me, so real I turned around to look. Nobody was there, but the feeling remained. And she heard, clear as day, not with her ears but inside her mind, "I made you for greatness. Stop settling for death." She collapsed, started sobbing, couldn't stop for an hour. When she finally stood up, she knew, with absolute certainty, that everything had changed. The addiction, the self-harm, the suicidal thoughts. It was like they belonged to a different person, to someone who no longer existed. She stayed for the whole retreat. And when she came down from that mountain, she was a different human being. Now, 2 years later, Maria runs a ministry for young women struggling with self-harm and eating disorders. She's helped over 200 girls find freedom. She doesn't have a degree in psychology. She doesn't have formal training. She just has her story and the fire burning inside her, and an absolute conviction that if God saved her, He can save anyone. She told me, "I'm not special. I was literally planning my suicide. But God chose to pour His fire into me anyway. And now I can't stop. I won't stop. Every girl I help, I see myself, and I know that this is what I was made for. Not just surviving, but pulling others out of the pit I was in. That's one person, one story. But there are thousands like Maria, tens of thousands, and the number is growing exponentially. Young people who were dead inside, who are now alive and on fire, who cannot rest until they've pulled others into that same fire. They're not waiting for the church to organize them. They're not waiting for permission or approval. They're just doing it. Starting prayer groups, creating online communities, organizing retreats, visiting prisons, serving the homeless, going into the darkest places, addiction recovery centers, psychiatric wards, red light districts, and bringing light. And everywhere they go, the fire spreads. Because when you meet someone who was genuinely dead and is now genuinely alive, you cannot dismiss them. You cannot ignore them. Their very existence is a challenge to your despair. If God saved them, maybe He can save you too. This is what Pier Giorgio saw. This is what all those prophecies were pointing toward. Not just a generation that survives the darkness. A generation that becomes light in the darkness. That becomes hope for the hopeless. That becomes proof that God is real and active and still in the business of transforming lives. But here's the hard part. Here's what Pier Giorgio's second letter makes clear. This fire doesn't come without cost. He wrote, "Some of you will die young as I did, because when you live with this kind of intensity, when you burn this brightly, when you threaten the kingdom of darkness this directly, there's a price. Some of you reading this will give your lives for this mission. Maybe not through martyrdom in the traditional sense, though that's possible too, but through pouring yourselves out completely, through spending yourselves utterly in service of others, through burning so intensely that you burn out young." Pier Giorgio did exactly that. He was 24. He could have lived a comfortable life, married well, built a successful career. Instead, he spent himself completely, climbing mountains, serving the poor, loving recklessly, and he died young. But his death wasn't the end. It was the beginning, because now, 100 years later, his fire is spreading to millions. His sacrifice is bearing fruit he never saw with earthly eyes, and that's the promise. If you give your life to this mission, if you let the fire consume you completely, your impact will multiply beyond anything you can imagine. You might not live to see it. Pier Giorgio didn't. But from heaven, you'll watch the fire spread. You'll see the souls you saved go on to save others. You'll see the mountains you climbed become paths for those who come after, and you'll know it was worth it. So here's the question I need to ask you directly. Are you going to let the fire burn? Or are you going to try to control it? Domesticate it, make it comfortable and safe? Because you can't do both. You can't be on fire and be comfortable. You can't burn brightly and protect yourself. You can't climb mountains and stay safe in the valley. Pier Giorgio's prophecy is clear. This generation is being called to something extraordinary, something dangerous, something that will require everything you have. But if you say yes, if you let the fire have its way, you will become part of the most powerful spiritual movement since the age of the apostles. You will be one of the ones they write prophecies about a century from now. You will be one of the ones who turned the tide when everything looked hopeless. You will be one of the lights that refuse to go out. And long after you're gone, young people in some future crisis will read about you and think, if God could do that through them, maybe He can do it through me too. That's the mission. That's what the fire was always for. Not just to save you, to make you a savior for others, to turn your testimony into a weapon against despair, to transform your survival into a roadmap for those still trapped in darkness. Pier Giorgio is waiting at the base of the mountain. He's been waiting for a century. He's throwing you the rope. All you have to do is grab it, start climbing, and refuse to let go. The valley is death. The mountain is life. Choose. If this story moved your heart, if it reminded you that there's still light even when everything seems dark, subscribe now, leave your like, and share this with someone who might need to hear it. Maybe someone close to you is standing at the edge of a valley, trying to decide whether to climb. Maybe they need to know that the mountain is still climbable, that others have made it to the summit, that the view from the top is worth every painful step. Pier Giorgio Frassati spent his whole life climbing mountains and pulling others up with him. Then he spent a century in heaven doing the same thing, waiting for this generation, your generation, to remember that you were made for heights, not valleys. The fire is spreading. The young people are waking up. The prophecy is unfolding exactly as he said it would. The only question left is, will you be one of the ones who burns?